without further ado, let's jump to our first guest of the day. Michael Hiltzik is a columnist at the Los Angeles Times, and he joins us now here on Jimmy at the Crossroads once again. Michael, welcome back, sir. Good to talk with you.
Good to be back.
Hey, I'm liking the hat. Good setup for today. Having a little fun on a Monday.
Yeah, well, I'm just trying to hide the fact that I haven't had a haircut in about 2 months now. Unlike you, apparently.
Well, in my case, see, I had a feeling that we weren't going to be able to get haircuts for very long. And so some point last month, I got my hair cut. And then within a week, everything was, the notice came down, you can't hold open these salons and so forth. So I was like, thanking God that I thought, hey, I need to get my hair cut now instead of waiting later. So I got it a few, 3-4 weeks ago, but I missed got in advance rather of the shutdown of hair salons. So I lucked out that way. All right, well, how are you doing right now, Michael, amidst all of the craziness with the coronavirus, the shutdowns, all those things?
I'm doing fine. We're all doing fine in this house, but I work from home normally, so it's not much of a change for me, except that I'm busier than I've been in years. So.
Sure. Well, I can imagine. I've been seeing you've written quite a lot, and let's dive right into a big picture question. At this point in time, how do you think things are panning out as far as the coronavirus mitigation effort and all this talk of getting to a point where we are able to successfully, as the phrase goes, reopen the economy?
Well, in California, it's gone very well. I think the numbers tell the story that early action by our governor and many mayors has helped to flatten the curve, if not crush the curve. So we have, on a per capita basis, a lot fewer cases, certainly fewer deaths than in other communities, but our political leaders are making sure that they're not signaling that they're ready to reopen at this point, which I think is wise. So I think California communities will be very wary of premature resumption of the sorts of activities that could create a new wave. I think, what all the experts tell us, and I'm talking about epidemiological and medical experts, not political experts, is that we need much more thorough capacity for testing. We need a lot more tests. We need to be able to direct tests where there are suspicions of outbreaks. And it's going to be a while before the U.S. gets to that point because we've been so late in ramping up.
What do you think, though, Michael Hiltzik, about opening up certain states, certain parts of the country that really are not seeing, or that are seeing success in flattening the curve and slowing the spread of this virus? And I don't mean this month, but getting into May. Dr. Fauci, for example, has been talking even about his timeline goal. In fact, let's play cut 7. This is Dr. Fauci on CNN yesterday being asked about the possible timeline in his view.
Based on what you know right now, when do you think the country will be ready to take some of these steps to reopen based on the availability of testing? When do you see that happening?
Jake, that's a great question. And that's really what I was inferring when I said a rolling reentry. It is not going to be a light switch that we say, okay, it is now June, July, or whatever, click, the light switch goes back on. It's going to be depending where you are in the country, the nature of the outbreak that you've already experienced, and the threat of an outbreak that you may not have experienced. So it's going to having to look at the situation in different parts of the country. Obviously, New York, who went and is going through a terrible ordeal, is going to be very different from Arkansas, and you'll hear from the governor shortly, and very different maybe from some places on the West Coast, like Washington State, which have been successfully able to prevent that big spike. I think it's going to have to be something that is not one size fits all.
When do you think it could start?
I think it could probably start, at least in some ways, maybe next month. And again, Jake, it's so difficult to make those kinds of predictions because they always get thrown back at you if it doesn't happen. Not by you, but by any of a number of people. We are hoping that at the end of the month we could look around and say, oh.
So I think, Michael, in essence, we could describe that as cautious optimism on the part of Dr. Fauci. What'd you make of that?
Well, I'd call it caution. I don't know if it's optimism. Look, I think the important clause or phrase that he used is, it depends. It depends on the availability of testing. It depends on what we've seen in terms of community spread. And I think the most important thing is that it's not up to the president to reopen the economy. It's much more up to governors and
Correct.
mayors to decide whether their communities are ready. But even beyond that, it really is up to consumers. And you have to look around and you have to say, well, how willing are consumers going to be to go back to concerts or ball games where they're sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers? How much more willing are they going to be to go to conferences and conventions and festivals, whether they're indoors or outdoors? And the answer is that's probably going to be slower than everything. And I think if you're a restaurant owner, you're going to be making the calculation about whether it's worth reopening at any point if you don't think the customers will come back in large.
Right.
And that's going to take longer than anything. So I'd say, yeah, we could start to do step-by-step liberalizing of stay-at-home rules, at some point in May, but I think it's going to be much more like June, July, August, or even September when schools reopen before you see real signs that people are comfortable
Right.
being next to other strangers under any circumstance.
And I think it's an important point to say that at some juncture, hopefully the beginning of May, you will see states, as the phrase goes, reopening the economy and then leaving it up to the private business owners to determine, do they want the liability issues that could come up and so forth, and then also individuals to decide, do I want to go to a restaurant? Do I want to go to a baseball game or what have you as things open up increasingly? And I think that's good, where it then becomes the onus is back on to the individual and whether or not they feel comfortable. But I want to get to a couple of different issues that I know you've written about. One of them, President Trump has been lambasting the post office for the last couple of years, particularly because of Amazon and deals that they have with Amazon. And President Trump last week said, quote, "I'll tell you who's the demise of the post office," which is struggling right now amidst all of this. "It's these internet companies that give their stuff to the Postal Service. Packages." And he asserted that the Postal Service loses money, quote, "every time they deliver a package for Amazon or these other internet companies that deliver." Now, I looked into this a lot back previously, it was a year or two ago, when the president was lambasting the post office on the regular, it seemed, for their deal with Amazon that he considered some sort of a sweetheart deal. My research has shown me that packages have actually helped to save the post office, while mail itself, just regular first-class mail, was becoming a revenue loser. Talk to us about your thoughts on what I just said there, and then also the dynamics at play with President Trump and the Postal Service and what you've written about in the LA Times, Michael Hiltzik.
Yeah, well, I've done the same research that you've done, and I've come to the same finding, which is that, and I've characterized it, you could look at what Trump says and say, well, he's just ignorant. I think he's lying because he knows the truth. And if he doesn't know the truth, then he's deliberately not paying attention. The fact is, it's been tested and examined and scrutinized. The Postal Service does not lose money from its contract with Amazon. In fact, as I pointed out the other day, Amazon, not only are packages, look, the Postal Service's revenue from packages is growing even as package volume itself has fallen. So that's sort of a double boon to the Postal Service. It's raising the rates on packages and parcels is not going to create a profit for the Postal Service because it's just too small of a share of its total volume and revenue. But yes, look, Amazon is very good at logistics. What it does is it sorts its packages before it brings them to the Postal Service. It makes sure they get to the Postal Service at the closest point to delivery that it can. So it's probably cheaper for the Postal Service to ship Amazon parcels than other shippers, whether we're talking about FedEx or DHL, where the Postal Service often provides the last mile and delivery for a price. Now, the fact of the matter is, as everybody knows who's paid any attention to this, first of all, there's nothing in the rules and there's no sense in looking at the Postal Service as a service that should be profitable. That's not what it's about. It's a government service. It's there to do its job, whether it turns a profit per piece of mail or package or not. It's a public service. It's in the Constitution, as I've had to point out over and over again.
It's true, it is.
In Article 1 says, the government shall provide the Postal Service. We don't expect the roads to be profitable. We don't expect public schools to be profitable. They're public service, and they are government services because it's so hard and it doesn't make sense for them to turn a profit year by year. Now, added to that is this 2006 attack on the Postal
Looks like Michael Hiltzik, of course, we're talking with him via Skype, and occasionally you get some of these cutting in and out issues that might happen, so he's frozen up just a tad. We'll get to Michael Hiltzik in just a moment. Although one thing that I do want to clarify and bring this point up as we get Michael back on here on Jimmy at the Crossroads is that the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, enlisting the enumerated powers of Congress under the U.S. Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 doesn't actually say shall. So this is one point. As soon as we get Michael back, I want to talk with him about. It says that they have the power to establish post offices and post roads, which, there we go. It looks like we have Michael, so we're getting him queued up back into the software program here on Jimmy at the Crossroads again. Michael Hiltzik is a columnist at the Los Angeles Times. And Michael, I just wanted to double check my recollection. You said that the United States shall have a post office or postal service is stated in the Constitution. Under Article 1, Section 8, in the enumerated powers, it says the Congress has the power to establish post offices and post roads. It doesn't say that it shall or that it needs to. The authority is given, absolutely. So I have no question on that. It is there, and most Americans, I think, don't understand that that is the case. But I do think that is an important distinction, especially at another time we can get into this. I'm a believer in phasing out the public role of the post office and privatizing the institution. But I think it is important to at least acknowledge it's created in the Constitution, but at the same time, it's not mandated in the Constitution. But please go back to what you were saying.
Well, look, for the last 240 years or whatever, we've taken this as a government service. We know that the post office binds this country together. And by the way, I sort of look at this in terms of the liquor store analogy. I mean, why do liquor stores get regulatory relief from Congress and state legislatures? It's because every lawmaker has one in his district or her district. And that's true of post offices too. I mean, one of the things that Congress does more than anything else is pass resolutions naming local post offices after local luminaries. Anytime the Postal Service has talked about closing post offices or cutting back on service, there's been an uproar, a bipartisan uproar in Congress. We are just not a country that's geared to letting the Postal Service die. There's one person in the entire government who talks about letting the Postal Service die, and that's Trump. And he really should just shut up.
Well, let me say that in terms of the post office, one interesting paper that I read from a number of years ago, 2001, 2002, I'm in Colorado. Our governor, Jared Polis, then wrote a paper for the Independence Institute, a think tank in Colorado, where he even suggested the idea of privatizing the post office, which I found interesting. But I would agree that the president is not presenting the facts when he's talking about the post office and packages. I mean, the packages are the only reason that the post office is in existence is because, like, is able to be in existence right now without constant bailout funds is because of packages. But Michael Hiltzik, I want to shift gears here. We saw the stock market rise last week despite the bad unemployment news that we were getting of millions of Americans out of work. Now we are in well beyond 10 million Americans who have filed unemployment claims. You had a piece for the Los Angeles Times on how the stock market was rising despite the awful unemployment news. Why do you think that was the case? What's your view on
that? Last week, in the wake of, first of all, the unemployment news and also the rise in the stock market, is that the stock market doesn't care about your feelings. That's not what it's all about. The stock market doesn't look at the present much, and it certainly doesn't look at the past. The stock market is designed to discount the future. And when the stock market looks ahead, it looks ahead at the period when we will be out of the lockdown and out of the recession. And investors in the aggregate, and, an investor, deals emotionally with his or her portfolio, but investors in the aggregate basically show a different phenomenon. But investors in the aggregate are looking ahead to the fact that we are going to get through this at some point. There's a debate as to when and to what degree, but that's what the market's looking at. The market isn't looking at today's or last week's or next week's unemployment figures. It knows, investors in the aggregate know they're going to be bad and know why they're going to be bad. And they're going to be bad because we've put the economy in a deep freeze for some period of time. Nobody seems to think that there's some sort of structural problem in the economy as there was in 2008 or in 1999 that justifies a major pullback. Mm-hmm. So, I think that the stock market is looking ahead, and it's saying that it's reached the point where it's discounted the prospect of an economic slowdown, and it's now looking at the beyond that.
Yeah. Well, I think that there will be another wave at some point where we will see stock market declines once you get earnings coming in, and not just earnings, and particularly second quarter earnings, so in a few months from now, not just earnings themselves, but what those earnings show, Michael Hiltzik, about the trajectory of these individual companies, their health, their ability to recover from the economic malaise that we're currently enduring. But there's a lot of talk going on in Washington, D.C. about the idea of a phase 4 deal, what needs to happen next. I am of the mindset where you can fund a little bit more to some of the existing programs. For example, I'm open to the idea of expanding funding for the Paycheck Protection Program for small businesses to continue to be able to get loans from the Small Business Administration. But I'm not on board with the idea of adding new expansive programs or this and that in order to address this current situation. I think you can put some funding behind things that were already in the previous CARES Act, particularly the best provisions. But what do you think needs to happen from your standpoint, Michael Hiltzik?
Well, I think we need more. Basically, I think we need a much more secure coverage of income for people who've been furloughed or laid off. That might mean another stipend like the $1,200 that's beginning to show up in people's bank accounts now. I think we should look at other countries that have gone through this. Denmark is often mentioned. Denmark is just covering 80% of the wages of workers who were exposed to job losses, so that their employers don't have to fire them. I think, that's a positive idea. we have the money to do that. We should do that to make sure that the job losses that we've seen over the last 3 weeks of unemployment reports don't persist beyond the point that they have to.
So, in terms of expansions here, do you think there needs to be additional programs added on, or is it just funding more the things that Congress did in the CARES Act, such as the unemployment provisions you're talking about?
Well, we need more. I think we have to be ready to extend the unemployment provisions for at least another month, maybe 2 months. I think we need to do another stipend for adults and children so that people have the money to pay their rent and buy food. I think we certainly need something in there that protects the election. The spectacle that we saw in Wisconsin of people having to line up personally, exposing themselves to sickness so that they could vote, that's appalling and it's disgusting. Yeah. And by the way, that's a Republican stunt. So that needs to be stopped. We need to make sure that people can vote by mail, vote remotely, the way Donald Trump votes remotely.
So let me jump in there, because
we need to take care of that.
Let's talk about the mail voting, because I had a couple of weeks ago former Colorado Secretary of State Wayne Williams. I know California is one of the states that's been doing mail balloting. Here in Colorado, we were the third state after Oregon and Washington to take that step. And I'm actually, in the beginning, I had strong reservations. I think it's worked out well here in Colorado. And what I would say is, based on our experience in talking with experts such as former Secretary of State Wayne Williams and others who really know this stuff well, is that here in Colorado, it took about a decade for us to get to the point where people were even clamoring for mail balloting. And when we got to that particular point, we were ready for it as well, because the infrastructure was in place. We had the experience. We knew what needed to happen. There are a lot of challenges and issues that can come upon us when you're trying to implement a mail ballot system. And while I agree with you in theory that it would be good for all of these states to move to a mail ballot, and I say that as a conservative guy. I mean, I think and I'm talking with other Republican experts in Colorado that are dealing with election issues and have for many years, who agree with me that the president shouldn't be saying the things that he's saying about mail balloting, and Republicans around the country are getting it wrong. But in this point in time, election integrity and voter the security of the ballots is essential, and you need to make sure that if you're moving towards that system, that you do it right. And I just don't know that there are states around the country that are equipped to make that switch. And not only that, but we're seeing what's happening with ventilators and with other PPE that are needed for medical professionals across the country to deal with this crisis. There are only a few companies in the nation that are capable of doing the ballot printing, especially on a large scale. We don't want ballots to become the new ventilators, Michael Hiltzik. So I would like to see more of a switch to mail balloting. I just don't know how practical that is this year to do it in a massive scale.
Well, that's why we need Congress to step in, provide the funding to do it. There's no reason why it can't be done. Every state has a system of absentee balloting by mail. Nobody says that absentee ballots are any less secure or any less efficient or effective than having to go out and, you sign your name in front of 3 or 4 old ladies who have nothing better to do than to be election monitors. And by the way, there is going to be a clamor for this. Starting now. And we saw the clamor in
Michael Hiltzik, our guest from the LA Times, cutting in and out a little bit again there as we wrap up and wind down our conversation with him. See if we can give just a quick second. I think the rosier scenario that Michael seems to be painting here is a little bit untenable at this point in time. I don't see how that switch can be made, even if you did have some sort of congressional action. I think the challenges are more difficult now. encouraging it, I have no qualms with that if you can make that sort of a switch, but I think that there are difficulties in it. We do need to go to a break, though, so sorry to Michael Hiltzik for how we're ending our conversation with him here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, but he's always a fascinating guest giving us perspective from the left here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. I have had many a spirited debate with Michael Hiltzik, and I look forward to more conversations down the line. I am Jimmy